Welcome into One of One Sports. It's a huge day in America. It's the college football playoff rankings reveal. So, we're going to be doing what I think the committee should do in this week's rankings. Not a projection of what they will do, just what I would do. So, starting off, teams that just missed the cut. Vanderbilt was really close. That loss to Georgia State holds them back. Missouri, the way they played against quality teams, kept them out for me. ASU, pretty good. The loss to Cincinnati, lost to Texas Tech. It's not great. Texas Tech was probably the closest team to making it. The loss to Baylor kind of hurts them. Iowa's on an upward trajectory, playing really well recently. And then Tulane losses early and again has been rolling recently, but not the greatest strength of schedule. So these are the top teams that I almost put in. Also looked at Minnesota, Illinois, but these were the closest ones. Getting into the top 25, start with Pitt at 25. We have their best win and worst loss for every team. Syracuse being your best win, not great. And the way they got dominated by SMU and was the best team they played so far this year really knocked them down for me. 7-1's a good record, but not a great strength of schedule there, right? So that's why Colorado I had ahead of them because I think win to Cincinnati's not great. Slightly stronger strength of schedule, but 25-24, it's splitting hairs there. If you wanted to go Pitt ahead, you could. I think Colorado's looked better. Eye test-wise, slightly better in terms of strength of schedule. And the loss to Nebraska, I think Nebraska was better early in the year, but you still got dominated, so it's not a great loss. Clemson, probably the hardest team for me to rank because if I had done this before last week, I would have had Clemson top 10, right? Even when they had a bad strength of schedule, like your best win's NC State. But playing the only two quality teams you played did not go well at all. That's got to knock them pretty low for me. What's keeping them up is you were so dominant against the teams you should be dominant against that I still kept them at 23. 22, I went with Army, undefeated, but you've played basically nobody. I think only one team with a winning record, so it's hard for me to go any higher. Washington State, I went ahead of Army because of the Texas Tech win, and Boise State's not a bad loss at all. We'll see Boise State later on higher in these rankings. Getting into 20 through 16, I went with Kansas State at 20. Your best win's Colorado, top 25 victory on the road, so that's pretty good. But the Houston loss is pretty bad, especially the way they lost it and just the way they've looked the last couple of weeks. Almost losing to Kansas, losing to Houston. It was disappointing from them and knocked them down for me. Louisville, I went above Kansas State because even though they have 3 losses, it's all to teams we'll see higher in these rankings. Notre Dame, Miami, and SMU are all top 15 team teams. You'll see where in a second. And then you have the big win against Clemson, which I think is a little bit better than the Colorado win. And no bad losses. Competitive games against 3 really good teams. So that kept them at 19, just below South Carolina, who's really comparable to Louisville. Again, 3 losses to all top 15 teams. And A&M, Ole Miss, they beat Texas A&M, sorry. Ole Miss, Alabama, LSU. But the A&M win is better than the Clemson win. And I think they played a tougher strength of schedule with like the Kentucky win. And that made me put South Carolina just ahead of Louisville. But behind Ole Miss, who beat South Carolina in dominant fashion. But they lost to Kentucky and then they lost to LSU, which is the reason you stay behind LSU when you have similar record. I go with head-to-head there. LSU at 16. The Ole Miss win's really good. The USC loss is a bad loss at this point. USC is like a bottom half of the Big Ten team. Beat them on a neutral site. It's a bad loss, and that keeps them out of the top 15. And another thing that keeps them out of the top 15 is the fact they lost to Texas A&M, who I have at 15, having beaten LSU as their best win. Did lose to South Carolina pretty badly. But the win, I think 7-2 record, still I'm able to keep them above South Carolina. And it was on the road, tough spot. I think A&M is a pretty good team. The other loss to Notre Dame, not terrible, and they've been playing better since then. Big win against Missouri as well, that LSU win. So pretty good resume. I like them at 15. Below Alabama, though, because Alabama has the Georgia win, which is one of the best wins any team in the country has, which really builds their strength of schedule. And the worst loss to Vanderbilt, who's actually a pretty good team, not almost considered for top 25. So not a terrible loss, and then the loss to Tennessee, also not terrible. So really, Alabama's still alive for the playoff at 14. Iowa State at 13. Obviously just lost their first game, no longer undefeated, but Texas Tech almost in the top 25. It's not a horrible loss. It's not great because you were at home, 2-touchdown favorite. You'd like to win that. And your best win against Iowa, similar caliber team at Texas Tech. Rest of the Big 12 teams he played mediocre for the most part, 7-1, good team. Went below Notre Dame because Notre Dame has that Texas A&M win, which is really good, and I like the better wins rather than judging the worst loss, because obviously Notre Dame's loss to Northern Illinois is worse, but I think the wins are more important. I know it kind of seems contradicting because Boise State beat Washington State, which is below A&M, but a loss to Oregon's a lot different than a loss to Texas Tech. Oregon is really high in these rankings, as you guys probably guessed, so losing to a team like that by 3 is not the same as losing at Texas Tech, which is why I have Boise 11. Now we can get into the top 10, where at 10 I have Texas. Your best win being Vanderbilt on the road is a decent win, but not as good as some of the other wins teams have. And you lost to Georgia. Obviously not a bad loss. Georgia's yet to come, but you did get dominated by Georgia at home, which is why Penn State, which has a loss to a similar caliber team in Ohio State at home as well, but was more competitive there. And then Illinois, the Illinois win I think is not quite as good as the Vanderbilt win, but it's close. And I think Penn State has played in the Big Ten some other decent teams, like USC at the time I thought was a good win. Wisconsin's not a bad team per se. And then the out-of-conference win at West Virginia is pretty good. Texas beat Michigan, which is, about this caliber of Big Ten team Penn State's beaten. So those teams were really neck and neck for me. There's, if you wanted to swap Texas and Penn State, I'm fine with that. I think they have really similar resumes in terms of their wins and losses and how they lost. It was really just Texas being blown out by Georgia that led me to putting Penn State above them. I have SMU above both of those teams. Pitt being your best win is, I would say, better than either win Penn State or Texas has right now. Maybe. I think Vanderbilt's better than Pitt, personally, but based off the rankings, got to go with Pitt there. But then the loss to BYU, an undefeated team by 3 at home, is again similar to the Georgia and Ohio State losses. So very similar resume, but SMU also has the win against Louisville, which I think is a better second win than either Texas or Penn State has. So a little bit better wins and a similar loss, at least based off my rankings. I don't actually think BYU is as good as Ohio State and Georgia, but I'm trying to keep this ranking, keeping personal bias out of it, just how they played this year. And BYU has played on a similar level to those teams, at least up to this point. Tennessee, I have above all of them because Alabama is a good win, and Arkansas is, it's a worse loss than any teams, but Alabama's a much better win. And they've also beaten, you beat NC State from the ACC convincingly. Oklahoma you beat, who's not a great team, but it's a win. Florida and Kentucky are fine. Not the best eye test team for Tennessee, but a pretty good resume, so it was an interesting one. Miami I have at 6, undefeated. Louisville, best win, but you played a lot of really close games, but no losses, so we put them at 6. I think they will move higher in the future. Getting into the top 5, our final 5 teams, this is what it is. I've got Indiana at 5. No losses, undefeated like Miami. Best wins Nebraska, so maybe not as good of a win as Miami, but has been far more convincing, blowing teams out, putting teams away the way they should put bad teams away, and has just passed the eye test a lot better than Miami has, especially with how suspect Miami's secondary has looked. BYU, another undefeated team, I have above both of them because I think, like Indiana, or it's kind of in the middle. They've looked not as convincing as Indiana, but have played a much more difficult schedule. Beating Kansas State, I went with as their best win, but you could also go SMU. But I thought the way they beat Kansas State was more convincing. But so much stronger strength of schedule than the other two teams led me to put them at 4. Then Ohio State, Georgia was really close for me, losing like Texas, Penn State, neck and neck. But ultimately, Alabama's a worse loss than Oregon, and the way Georgia went down against Alabama led me to put, like Ohio State, you lost by 1 point to Oregon on the road, who is my number 1 team in the country. Pretty easy here. The Ohio State win, I think, is the best win in the country right now, at least in terms of the rankings, like you see. Boise State, another great win, borderline top 10 team, and has looked dominant the past few weeks. How they beat Illinois, a good win. Beat Michigan on the road, pretty good win. And I think Oregon's clearly the number 1 team in the country. Well, this is what I think the committee should do with the rankings. Make sure, leave a comment. Let me know, what do you guys disagree with, what I get wrong, how would you rank these teams? Leave a like, subscribe, and until next time.